Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Anderson, and I'm the president and CEO of the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all back in person for our Sustainers Lecture. Thank you. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our season and exhibition sponsors, Leslie and Cliff Hudson, the Oklahoma Humanities, Chuck and Renata Wiggin, Foundation Management, Inc., Mr. and Mrs. Duke Ligon, and the Honorable Jerome A. Holmes. So let's give them all a round of applause. I'm also very pleased to thank our two organizing institutions for this exhibition, this wonderful exhibition. And I hope if you haven't already seen it, that you spend a few minutes after this lecture looking at it. It really is remarkable. The National Academy of Design and American Federation of Arts. And I'm going to start by introducing our first visitor from American Federation of Arts, Andrew Eschelbacher. He's the Director of Curatorial Affairs for American Federation of Arts, an organization that we have had a very long relationship with. I'm not sure if Andrew will say anything about that. It has been as old as this institution, I believe, maybe even a little bit longer. The last time we hosted one of their exhibitions was at Victorian Radicals. We were the first of 8 venues for that exhibition. Now we are the 8th of 8 venues for this exhibition. So we're kind of coming full circle. So it's been perfected. You'll see a perfect exhibition up on the 3rd floor. But I'm going to bring Andrew out now, and he's just going to say a few words. Andrew Eschelbacher.
Thank you all for having us, for being great partners with AFA. AFA since 1909 has been a leader in organizing traveling exhibitions internationally with the goal of creating more access for art, because art has the potential, according to our founding mission, to give people new ideas onto the world, which is part of a just society. And that's what we've been working on for the last 112 years, and thrilled to bring it here again to Oklahoma City with For America. And we couldn't be prouder to have co-organized this exhibition with the National Academy of Design. It's really a hallmark of what we do is we work with great collections, great people, and we bring it to great partner venues and form these lasting relationships, as Michael said. First of all, I would like to thank our colleagues at the National Academy of Design for making this possible. Director Greg Wessner, and most importantly, Diana Thompson, Director of Collections, who you'll hear from in a moment. We couldn't do this without all of the partner venues on our tour. There have been 8 so far on this tour, or there are 8 on this tour. Don't worry, Diana, I'm not selling another venue. 8 on this tour, and we're thrilled to be back in Oklahoma City. As I said, thank you to Michael, thank you to the whole team here in Oklahoma. We love coming back here. We love working with you all. We have a few national sponsors for this exhibition that have made the national tour possible: the JFM Foundation, Monique Schoen-Warshaw, and Steph and Jody Lanasa. And finally, thank you all, because it's museum communities around the country, patrons, friends, art lovers, who inspire our work and allow us to do what we do. So thank you for being here, thank you for seeing our shows, thank you for supporting your museums. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you again to the American Federation of Arts. And yeah, I didn't want to say this, but I do believe that we were actually first partnered with them before this museum even existed in the 1930s. So that's how long our relationship goes back with AFA. On to tonight's speaker. So Diana Thompson is Director of Collections at the National Academy of Design. She is the co-curator of For America Paintings from the National Academy of Design, which is a major traveling exhibition of, I believe it's 99 paintings at this venue from the Academy's permanent collection, accompanied by a richly illustrated scholarly catalog that opened at the Dayton Art Institute in Ohio in early 2019, and again traveled to 7 additional U.S. venues before completing its tour here in Oklahoma City. Diana oversees a collection of nearly 8,000 works of American art and architecture, which is remarkable, which she just launched on the online platform eMuseum in September. In addition, she recently began a multi-year strategic plan for the National Academy's collection, which will include surveying and digitizing the collection, developing a long-range conservation plan, and updating and improving collection management, cataloging, collecting, and ethics policies. Ms. Thompson holds BAs in Psychology and French from Fairfield University and a Master's in Art History from Hunter College. She has studied and worked abroad in England, France, and Greece, and is a member of the American Alliance of Museums, the Association of Art Museum Curators, the College Art Association, the International Council of Museums, and the Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists. So we're in very good hands. Let's all give a very warm round of applause to Diana Thompson.
Hi, everyone. All right. Good evening. I am so happy to be here, and on behalf of the National Academy, I'm thrilled to be with you for the opening of For America at its last venue. I really can't believe it, thinking back to the start of the tour in early 2019, when the world was such a different place. And I cannot think of a better way to round out this journey than being here with all of you in person, not over Zoom, to celebrate this exhibition and share it with the Oklahoma City community. A huge thanks to Michael Anderson, Catherine Shoddick, and of course everyone at the American Federation of the Arts, and everyone else at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art for putting this evening together. So I have a lot that I'd like to share with you in a little bit of time, so I'm going to jump right in. To start off, I'd like to share some information about the history of the National Academy of Design, how this exhibition came about, and then give you a brief walkthrough of the show, which then you can see in its all its grandiosity in person. So the National Academy was founded in 1825 by Samuel Morse and a small group of young artists in response to being turned away from the American Academy's collection of antique casts from which they would draw. So at this time now in the States, there were two academies that predated the National Academy. The first, the American Academy in New York, which was led by John Trumbull, you see here on the right, and he was of an older generation, and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Now, these academies were founded by wealthy businessmen and patrons to provide a place to show art, but artists were largely left out of the process and the conversations. So Morse and his cohorts decide, well, if we don't have access to these casts, then we're going to go off and do this on our own. So they began as a small group who would gather a few nights a week and sketch by candlelight. So the National Academy, it's really a story of self-governance. They really believed that no one but artists should be telling artists what tools they need to succeed, and thus became the National Academy of Design. So a few words about our name, because design means something very different today than it did in the 19th century. At our founding, there were 4 categories of membership: painting, sculpture, engraving, and architecture. And these were considered the arts of design, as compared to the broader fine arts, which included things like theater or poetry, for example. In 2011, the categories of membership changed to just visual arts and architecture in order to welcome in artists working in various contemporary modes beyond painting, sculpture, and engraving, like video and performance art, for example. So the structure of the NAD. The structure was really solidified in the founding years into a tripartite structure that included an honorary society of artists and architects, who are our national academicians, the annual exhibition, and a school of fine arts. So at the core of the Academy's education involved working from the antique, which you see on the left, an example from the 19th century, students working from the Academy's collection of antique plaster casts, some of which we still have today, and then eventually from live models, and you see an example on the right in the 30s of that. And then a little bit later, adopting a style from Europe, an atelier style, where students would study under one master teacher throughout their academic tenure. The annual exhibition was really the who's who in American art during the 19th century. And here's an image from Harper's Weekly from 1882, showing what was described as the, quote, fair and fashionable of New York City coming to see the Academy's annual exhibition. And this really was a forum that helped launch the career of many artists, and it certainly helped launch the success of the Hudson River School, the first official school of painting in America. So let's get to the topic at hand, which is the artwork. Throughout the Academy's nearly 200-year history, we're about to celebrate our 200th anniversary in 2025, we have been amassing a large and unique collection of art. Okay, so how was it formed? Since the founding, artists have been elected in by their peers on the basis of merit. And upon their election to National Academician, they submit a representational work called their diploma work. You see here on the left, Emanuel Leutze's diploma work. It's a remarkable study of George Washington for the masterpiece that I'm sure many of you have either seen or heard of, George Washington Crossing the Delaware, which is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then from early in the founding years until 1994, there was a second level of membership that preceded that of National Academician, and that was the Associate National Academician. So for this level of membership, one was required to submit a portrait of themselves, and this could be a self-portrait or one done by a colleague. And here on the right is the diploma portrait that Leutze did of his good friend Worthington Whitridge, who actually served as Leutze's model for General Washington. And I think maybe we can see a little similarity in the nose, maybe. But I would like to point out that it is important to note that we also have so much more in our collection than just paintings. Just a few examples, some more recent examples, a wonderful photograph by Catherine Opie, Polly Applebaum's really beautiful fabric sculpture, and Marlon Blackwell's recently submitted incredible architectural model. So why did we choose just paintings for this show? When thinking about what this exhibition would be, we decided to focus on the paintings as a way to honor the founders. Out of 30 founding members, over half were painters. So we set out to build this exhibition around the paintings that would tell an alternate history of American art that has largely been overlooked. It's essentially an alternate history of modernism. And then we decided that we would structure the show around this idea of pairs. And there are 3 different types of pairs that you will see as you go through the exhibition, and I'll explain them now. So the first type of pair, which is probably pretty obvious, is the artist's diploma work with their diploma portrait. And you see here George Tooker's diploma work, a quintessential Tooker work with these mysterious, kind of eerie characters in unusual spaces, and his diploma portrait. And I love this because, you see his hand kind of resting over the ledge, kind of toying between painting and reality, and you can almost really see Tooker as being another character in one of his paintings. So the way that these two works speak to one another is so fascinating, in my opinion. So the second type of pairing are what we were calling ahistorical pairings that allowed us to trace the trajectory and the lineage of this representational and figurative tradition. So note the uncanny similarities between these two works painted over a century apart. Look at the formal similarity. They both sit in this 3/4 view, looking out towards the audience. They both have their stylus and sketchbook at hand. They are ready to set out depicting the world around them. And at several previous venues, we actually chose to hang Eliza Greatorex and Will Barnett at the beginning of the show or at the end of the show, just because of how striking the pairing is. And it almost sensitizes the viewer, I think, to look out for these reoccurring tropes and motifs that you'll see throughout the show. So finally, for the third type of pairing, we invited current National Academicians to comment on a work of their choosing, because after all, we are a contemporary living institution, and our members across generations can and should have dialogue with one another. So in this example, Joan Quick-to-See Smith, her work here on the right, who is American Indian, commented on Bierstadt's On the Sweetwater near Devil's Gate. Now, Bierstadt's work depicts an area in Wyoming that was a fur trader's post, and he does it in a typical Bierstadt way, a grand, magnificent-looking, beautiful, almost idealized landscape. But, as Joan states in her chat panel, which you would see in the exhibition, in 1855, just 5 years before this work was painted, the Hellgate Treaty was signed, which essentially took land from American Indians in Wyoming, Idaho, and part of Canada. She talks about how her ancestors were forcibly resettled. So this reminds us that when we say American art, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And we really wanted these commentaries to be a lens through which people could see these works in a different way and from a different perspective. So now I'm going to give you a brief walkthrough of the show. So it's broken up into sections. Our first section is called Founding an American School, and it really explores the rise of the Hudson River School and American genre painting in the first half of the 19th century. And here on the left, we have Asher B. Duran's self-portrait. He was one of our founders and an early president of the National Academy. Thomas Cole, another founder, was the father of the Hudson River School, which I'm sure many of you know. But when he dies at a rather young age, Duran really takes over the mantle. And here on the right is Duran's landscape, and it's painted just 2 years after Cole's death. It's depicting two artists, unidentified, not meant to be anybody in particular, but two artists resting amid a scene that strongly suggests an idealized landscape of the upper Hudson looking south to the Catskill Mountains. And I grew up in the Hudson Valley, so I love any images like this. So along with the rise of the Hudson River School was the development of American genre painting. And here's an example of Winslow Homer's little gem. It doesn't look so little here, but it's a little gem, the croquet player. And it's one of 5 that he did of this motif. And his portrait, painted by Oliver Ingram Lay, which had not been on view since it had been submitted, had not been on view until we conserved it for this exhibition. And it was so exciting because, I think there's a lot of graphic representations of Homer, but not many paintings. And I think this depiction of him really humanizes this otherwise mythical figure. Our next section is entitled A New Internationalism. In the latter part of the 19th century, scores of artists were returning stateside after studying at the great art centers of Europe, like Paris and London, Munich, Dusseldorf. This section really reveals the impact of contemporary European art and art education on the pedagogy of the Academy and its School of Fine Arts. William Whittemore's iconic portrait on the left of his friend Charles Courtney Curran, on the left, Whittemore and Curran became friends in New York and left together in 1888 to study in Paris. Whittemore depicts his friend copying from a classical statue in the Louvre, which was such a common practice for students and artists. And this really is, it's one of our iconic works in the collection, but I think it really is this archetypal image of the American artist studying in Paris. On the right is this wonderfully, pensive painting by Wyatt Eaton in his Paris studio. This is one of the earliest depictions of the artist in their studio from our collection, so certainly in the show. And it's a theme that you'll see reappear time and time again throughout the exhibition. Also in this section, you'll see the influence of European artistic trends like Impressionism, to name one. And this is a wonderful trio. We have Frieseke's Hollyhocks on the left, which he painted in Giverny, where Monet made his home, alongside Childe Hassam's Impressionist work, and the two works are pretty much contemporaneous, done in very different locales, but you see the similar influence in both of them. And then, Childe Hassam was an important member of the artist colony in Old Lyme, Connecticut. And then we see here on the right, Walter Hatke connecting to this lineage nearly a century later with his handling of the paint and certainly with his handling of the light. Now, this is a stunning painting in person, and it has been a fan favorite at all the venues that I've gone to. So it's really extraordinary. I also urge you to spend some time in awe of this one. We can also see in this section what happens when peers turn their gaze on one another, as well as the wonderful example of friendships that often existed between members of the National Academy in these two iconic works by William Merritt Chase and Robert Bloom. They were great friends. They traveled throughout Europe together in the early 1880s. They frequently depicted one another, and they were even elected Associate National Academicians in the same year. And Chase was criticized often for this sort of aloofness of his painted subjects, but I think that is not the case in his depiction of his good friend, which I think is a very warm and kind of sweet, emotionally stirring portrait of his dear friend. So moving to our third section, entitled Painting America. And here it shows how the Academy in the early part of the 20th century made strides in widening its membership base. They wanted to really put the national in the National Academy. Before that, the institution was heavily New York-centric. So we start to see works representing various art colonies and satellites that were popping up around the country. Here we have Daniel Garber and his landscape, and he was a leading figure of the New Hope School of Pennsylvania Impressionism. And I was so struck by this self-portrait when I chose it for the show. I mean, in terms of, you look at the date of it, around 1911, and you look at his clothing and his hairstyle, and it looks decades ahead of its time, and I think he looks like a Brooklyn hipster. So it's just wonderful. So Taos, New Mexico, another very important art colony, and remains a thriving arts community today. And here we have Mary Shepard Green Blumenshine on the left, who was a very famous artist in her own right, possibly more famous than her husband, Ernest Blumenshine, on the right. Mary was only the second woman to win a gold medal at the Paris Salon. Mary Cassatt was the first. Again, here on the right, we have her husband's landscape of Taos, and he was really known as the founder of the Taos Art Colony. And then in the center, Al Kresch, years later, in his glowing, this is a work that really glows in real person too, so obviously slides don't do it justice. But it shows that this area continues to be a great inspiration to artists. Monhegan Island in Maine is another important satellite that is highlighted in the show, particularly with the work in a later section by this Hawaiian artist, Reuben Tam. And Monhegan Island was also hugely important, was a hugely important locale for artists like Robert Henry and George Wesley Bellows. And in the exhibition, you'll see Henry's portrait of George Wesley Bellows. So moving to our fourth section, which is entitled Post-War Realisms. So this section outlines how realism in its various incarnations remained a viable alternative to American abstraction in the post-war years, and the Academy's continuing support of the figurative tradition. So it's important to point out that an academy, by nature, is an exclusionary organization. And throughout its history, the National Academy has been resistant to change in one form or another. Until 1869, the membership body was drawn exclusively from the New York City area. And until the turn of the century, academicians were culled from the previous year's annual exhibition. It wasn't until 1992 that the Academy elected its first female president, the painter Jane Wilson. I wanted to highlight this pair by Huey Lee Smith. So in 1967, Huey Lee Smith became only the second African-American National Academician. Exactly 40 years earlier, Henry Ossawa Tanner had broken that barrier to become the first. Tanner's portrait, which is in the show, was painted by a close colleague, so Huey Lee Smith's associate submission is the first self-portrait by a black artist to enter our collection, and that work entered in 1966. Huey Lee Smith had stated that being elected to the National Academy of Design was the greatest accomplishment of his career. So you can only imagine the pressure he must have felt when painting this self-portrait and deciding how he wanted to represent himself. And then when looking at it with this enigmatic work called The Bridge, which we really don't know what it's about, but you think about what's going on in the country at this time. We are more than a decade into the civil rights movement. 1965 saw the march from Selma to Montgomery over the bridge. Or it could even be about trying or hoping to bridge the differences between us, a notion that resonates so profoundly in our society today. Another stunning and interesting pair is seen here by Charles Wyatt, one of the best-known African-American artists of the 20th century. And very interestingly, rather than a likeness of himself, Wyatt chose to submit for his diploma portrait a portrait of his great-aunt Hasty Baines, here on the right, who was born into slavery in 1857 on the Yellow Leaf Plantation in Ridgeland, Mississippi. While researching for this show, I found a letter in Wyatt's file that was penned by his wife shortly after his death, where she said that Hasty Baines stood for him as a symbol of wisdom and beauty and courage. And these are themes that Wyatt continued to explore in his more mature work, like the one on the left, which isn't representing a specific person, but rather a personification of courage. And this is Matriarch here on the right is another one of my favorite conservation stories that we got to do for this show. This work had only been out, I think maybe once since it had been submitted. And when we had it conserved, it revealed the most stunning transformation. It had been covered by a thick white film of efflorescence, which essentially occurs when the fatty oils in the paint rise to the surface, similar to the way you think of a white film covering a chocolate bar. And once it was removed, these beautiful jewel-like tones emerged that you can see, I think, especially in her face. So please spend some time looking at this one as well. So our fifth and final section is entitled For America. And here, I think we start to see an America that looks more like the America we know today in terms of diversity, more works by women artists, things of this nature. And here is one of our rather recently acquired diploma pieces by Kay Walkingstick. This landscape by Kay, a member of the Cherokee Nation, draws upon American landscape traditions, such as those of 19th century Hudson River School artist Albert Bierstadt. He comes up again. He would paint these large landscapes of the West that said, here is this wilderness, and it's ready for me to conquer it. And in a way, Kay's landscapes are her own reclaiming of that land. And you can see how she incorporates these beautiful traditional Native American designs throughout the work. I love this trio of self-portraits by women. They're all so different. Rosemary Beck on the left takes Courbet's famous Artist in the Studio and claims the composition for herself. She reverses the gender of the nude model, adds black cats instead of white dogs, and unlike Courbet, turns and directly faces the viewer. Louisa Matthias' daughter, an Icelandic artist, depicts herself as if she's saying, look, I am a serious artist, you need to take me seriously. And with Joan Quick to See Smith's work, which we saw earlier, she incorporates images from art history, like Durer's rabbit, and really creates and claims an art history of her own. And this is also a really great example of how some academicians have chosen to honor the portrait tradition by submitting a self-portrait as their diploma work, even though that level of membership and that portrait requirement was done away with in 1994. And this feels like a great way to end with these two self-portraits, the earliest in the show and the most recent in the show. And this slide is certainly misleading. As you'll see in the show, the Morse is about 3 inches high. But here he is showing himself as a serious artist. He's very young in this picture, I think around 19 years old. And it's a miniature on ivory, but he's actually painting a painting rather than painting a miniature. So he's saying, take me seriously. And then there's Peter Saul's work, which is about 60 inches high, who in his own way doesn't take himself too seriously with his grotesque bulging eyes and big potato teeth. So this is a great way, I think, to trace the artistic lineage over more than 2 centuries and a fitting place to wrap up. So thank you, everyone, and I think we are going to open it up to some questions. Anyone? Don't be shy. I told it all in a nutshell.
You mentioned earlier in your bio that you deal with ethics. What are some of the ethics you had to deal with when putting together this show?
Well, that's a great question. That was in relation to a strategic plan I'm starting for our collection, where the institution's never had an ethics policy for what we collect. So I can't say that it really applied to this, but what we wanted to make sure in this show, and it's a great question, we wanted to show the true story of the Academy. And as I mentioned, this institution, by its nature, was exclusionary, and we can't hide from that. We need to own it. So those are things that we did want to present, unadulterated. But then also show in our later sections how much it's changed and how much our membership is transforming to reflect America more. So does that answer your question?
You said you did away with the portrait requirement, and I'd love to know why.
That's a great question too, and we've done research to try to figure it out. And the only thing we can figure is that perhaps they felt that portraiture was falling out of favor. In 1994, they could have said that, years before that too. It could have been, the honest answer is we really don't know. It could have been a logistical thing. It could have been, we can't fit this many works in our storage. But it is really interesting how some members who were elected in after that have chosen to give a self-portrait. And I've had some who already, I'm thinking of one in particular, she's actually in the show, Jacqueline Gorovich. We have a, city painting by her, and she came to me a few years ago and said, I want to have a portrait in the collection. Can I give a self-portrait also? And she was by no means obligated to give another work, but it's one of the most unique aspects of our collection. And our portraits are the ones that are most frequently asked for on loan. Works that are in the show are Thomas Aiken's self-portrait, which there are so few of, Cecilia Bow, John Singer Sargent. So it's a really fascinating lineage and tradition that some of our living members want to be a part of. I mean, because, going through storage, it's so funny. There's so many artists who, quite frankly, we've never heard of, but they were a member. They were elected in. They gave a self-portrait. We know what they look like, and there's not maybe any other representation of them anywhere. So it's a good question, and I'm sorry I can't give you a good answer.
I think you should reinstate it.
And it's been talked about. But the process of working with new members for them to submit their work is it's very different nowadays than it was when the institute, say in the 19th century, even into the 20th century, when it was really being run by the council. And now that we have a professionalized museum staff, and things like that, the process goes a little bit different. So it can sometimes be a lengthy process. It's a conversation we start. Sometimes I've worked with one of our architects on his submission for 2.5 years. So in stating that again, well, I think it would be wonderful, and that has been brought up a number of times. We'll see. Yep.
Do you have any insight as to why the Academy considers architecture to be separate from visual art? I was originally thinking maybe because it's for function and form, but we have sculpture as function and form. Do you?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that we consider it separate because it was one of the original 4 categories, which were considered the arts of design. And when we changed the membership, architecture is still architecture, but we needed to be able to encompass all of the various contemporary art trends, which is why we changed that to visual arts. So we really don't consider them separate, and there's so many I mean, that's another thing that makes us very unique, the fact that we have members of both of these practices. And there's so many interesting things that we can do. Members who are architects who have done collaborations with artists and things like that, which you see all over the place, and you sometimes never think about the different visions that go into projects like that.
Okay, I have a question. So, that's what I went earlier, missing people. Do you just do self-submissions, or do you actually go after artists you want to have be part of the collection?
Who are members already, or?
Like that are not members, like over time, like I said, some people are not represented. Do they say, hey, we want to have somebody here, would you like to submit to us? Or is it just people say, I want to be part of this group?
Well, you can't solicit to be a member. Members are nominated and elected in by the current membership. So someone can't come to us and say, I want to be a National Academician, let me in. In terms of artists who are outside of the membership, another thing that makes us so unique compared to other museums is that we don't acquire works the way that other museums do. We don't have an acquisition fund. Our collection is formed by the donation of the members.
So the members decide they want to be accepted by that person, and then they give them something?
Normally it's the member themselves who says, this is what I want to donate. And that's how, and I think it was a rather quick process decades ago and in the 19th century, like I said, when it was really solely artist and architect led by the council. But now that we have a professionalized museum staff, I've worked with a number of members. Our curators worked with a number of members to have that conversation, to share with them what is in the collection. How do you want to be represented amongst this lineage? So, I rather like that now because it generates such interesting conversations and results in some pretty incredible submissions. So,
Yes.
Have you seen an increase or any artwork that used to be considered crafts, like quilting and embroidery, like non-traditional fine arts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, once we changed the categories to visual arts, that is certainly allowed, that type of work is allowed in. I'm trying to think. I know of ones who have been nominated who haven't been let in yet, so I don't know if I can say their names. But yes, that is certainly, we have tried to kind of wrap our arms around any and all forms of contemporary artistic practice, even ones that one would consider craft.
I feel like a majority of the works in the exhibit are very representational and naturalistic. So what was the process when you chose some of the more abstract works or like walking or quick seasmiths?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't. It's interesting you said Reuben Tam, because when I was walking around the show with Catherine Shoddick, she says this is the most abstract work in the show, isn't it? And I wouldn't consider Jones. I consider Jones to be a self-portrait, a figurative work. I mean, really, what we were trying to do, because of the way the Academy was and the ideals that it held, that's why we can tell this story almost 200 years, over almost 200 years, of this alternate story of modernism that largely, gets ignored because everyone focuses on, what came into the armory in 1913, what came over from Europe, early American modernism, abstract expressionism. So we can really show what this whole other, vein of American art that was happening, and all the different incarnations of the realism and representational work. So Tam's work is certainly a landscape, but it is rather abstract for sure.
So you just thought that those pieces were like the best, I guess, representation that changed the American art?
Well, I mean, there were, for Tam's work, we thought it was very interesting to connect Reuben Tam, a Hawaiian artist, to the Monhegan location in Maine, which was such an important satellite work. And sadly, we did have a beautiful bellows landscape in the show that we had to remove for some conservation concerns. And we were pairing the two together because they were essentially depicting the same location by two very different artists from two very different generations. So those were some of the thoughts behind some of the decisions of what to put in. I mean, it was very hard to decide what to choose for this show.
Is there a set number that could be admitted each year? And what criteria are a requirement to qualify to be considered? And then could you say all the members get to vote?
We're in a little flux with that. So the three questions you asked. So a number each year. There is no cap on the number of members that can be elected in each year, but there is a cap on the number of living members that we can have, and it's 450. And we are hovering around that right now. For instance, this year we elected in 8. And about 3 years ago, we had a class of about 37. So it all depends on the membership, how many people they nominate, and then when the voting process happens, how the votes go and who gets in. Did I answer all of those? Oh, criteria, right. It's basically what we say is any artist or architect who has made a significant contribution to American artistic culture, American visual culture. I think that's the wording. So, it used to be stricter in the 19th century. We had honorary members who were elected in as honorary members because they lived abroad or something. But we have many artists now who were born abroad. They may still work abroad, but they do need to have a presence and have made an impact in the U.S. Good? Okay. Thank you so much, everyone.